Awesome. So for those of you who are joining us, a couple of housekeeping items first. So this webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides will be distributed to everyone after the session. Second, we'll be saving some time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. We're expecting quite a few. We already received some in advance during the registration, so thank you for those that submitted questions in advance. But if at any point in time during the webinar you have additional questions that you would like, there's a question section of the GoToWebinar control panel. So please feel free to put those questions in along the way and we'll get to those at the end. But let's dive in for quick introductions. So myself, Michelle Winters, I'm VP of ESG Sales here at Conservice. I have over 17 experience focused on sustainability and ESG within commercial real estate. And I'm joined by Todd Brandell, VP of ESG Products here at Conservice. And Todd, you're uniquely positioned for the conversation today. I joke about it often, but we're really lucky to have you. So your original background was law. You also focus in real estate and sustainability, and you oversee the product side, which is going to set us up for success to track all of the things we're going to talk about today. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been the VP of product here at Conservice ESG for about 6 years. Previous to that was an attorney, did a little bit of energy procurement. So yeah, I do feel like I have a unique perspective on some of this BPS or building performance standard stuff, and really glad that everyone was able to take some time out of their day today to hear our presentation. So thank you for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. As Todd said, thanks for joining. And so today, what we're going to be focusing on is examining building performance standards, also known as BPS laws. We're going to discuss some of the origin of those BPS standards, how they coexist with other regulations like benchmarking ordinances, some similarities and differences between those BPS laws, general pathways for compliance, and more. I feel like it's important to note, we're not going to be diving into specifics on every single BPS law in depth during this live session. Otherwise, we might be here for a few weeks. They're fairly complex. So instead, today we're going to be focusing on just broader details about BPS and highlighting general strategies for compliance and really examining the future of these regulations. So that's the plan for today. We're excited to have you for about the next hour or so. But Todd, you started us off with this vibrant red 35. What is this 35 and what does it mean?
Yeah, I was going to ask the group, but I guess I realized that there's no sound and no one can actually answer. So this was going to be our icebreaker. And think about for a second what you think the significance of the number 35 is. Like, why would we talk about that here? Is it the speed limit on most local roads? Or we're going to talk about Kevin Durant today and his NBA career. But actually, no, that's not.
We get in a day.
What's that?
The number of text messages we get in a day.
Yeah, right, exactly. So
ideal age of midlife crisis. Oh, that was a good one. Someone just shouted that.
Yeah, ideal age of a midlife crisis, right? But no, we're here today because in the United States, buildings are the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and they represent around 35% of total energy-related emissions. And this split is almost split exactly equally between commercial and residential buildings. So the built environment, as we're all probably well aware being in this industry, is a very heavy contributor to the overall carbon emissions in our country and in the world. And that's really the driving force behind a lot of these BPS laws. And you can see that this quote is from the National BPS Coalition. And I'll just spend a quick minute talking about that. So this is a group, it's a voluntary group made up primarily of mayors of city. There's some governors involved. But it's basically a national coalition to say we need to be doing something about all of the emissions in our buildings and our cities. And we're all going to sign on to essentially be members of this organization that are going to promulgate these standards to help us try to get there. So the National BPS Coalition is behind a lot of these laws. They're a strong group and it's growing. And you'll see their impact here in a few minutes as we get through this presentation.
Well, that's a significant number. And I think it's really starting to show across all these different compliance reporting regulations that we're either familiar with or that are new, like the BPS we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to quickly start us off of setting the stage on maybe some different types of compliance reporting that you've seen within commercial real estate. The first that you are likely most familiar with is benchmarking ordinance compliance. This is ultimately on an annual basis, usually at the same time every year by city. You're required to submit utility data, 12 months whole building utility data, usually energy. Some cities and states have water as well, but it's just a share your data. It's a requirement to provide to that city or state and provincial ordinance requirement. Then, and there's about 47 of
really quick, Michelle, that you know, as everyone's probably aware with benchmarking, it's a rule that says you have to submit. Your performance is basically irrelevant. The only penalties are for not submitting. So you can be consuming 80 billion kilowatt hours a year, and it doesn't matter as long as you submit on time. You'll comply with those benchmarking standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's about 47 of those that are currently active right now. So quite a few, and it's continuing to grow and expand in its own rate. Another one is enhanced benchmarking. So this is kind of that next stage of now I need you to actually do something or show that you've done something if you're not hitting certain performance levels every X number of years. And this is slightly different. There's not as many. There's about 13. LA is an example of one, where every 3 to 5 years, again, it's different by cities, you're required to actually do something, such as a retrofit, an energy audit, or prove that you're hitting a certain Energy Star score. So that's the enhanced benchmarking. And then what we're excited to talk about today is building performance standards. So that's now, you have to meet certain performance requirements. So the first was, hey, just share the data. The enhanced is more, every so often I need you to prove that you're doing something. And now this third is going to be, no, I need you to hit certain performance metrics in order to avoid fines. And we're going to really spend the focus of our webinar today on that third one. So Todd, why don't you dive in for us?
Sure. So what exactly are building performance standards? Really, at its core, it's a new policy tool that establishes regulations requiring existing buildings to meet carbon or energy performance targets by certain deadlines. So that's really what it is. And it's, you know, the purpose behind a lot of these, the feedback had been that, yes, these voluntary requirements and some of these reporting requirements are great. They're not moving the needle as quickly as they need to. So the governments in these local jurisdictions, and it's gaining more steam federally, we'll talk about that in a little while, have decided that we need to introduce some teeth to these rules and say, this isn't voluntary, this isn't, hey, if, you know, can you please share with us about your data and your buildings and your performance? This is saying, if you fail to meet these established targets, there are going to be financial penalties, and some of them can be pretty significant. They're typically being passed at the local level, so the city level. There's a handful of counties that we'll talk about that have either passed or are talking about passing these, and increasingly some states, some statewide BPS laws. So over 600 local jurisdictions in the United States have some type of GHG reduction target. That doesn't mean it's a BPS law. Like we've said already, there's only 10 that are currently active, but there are definitely more coming. But there are 600 total that have some type of target, some type of goal that they're trying to reach to help reduce emissions from the built environment. We'll keep hammering this home, but we'll say it again, unlike benchmarking laws, a failure to comply with BPS can result in some significant financial penalties. So why are they doing this? And we've touched on this a little bit. So the buildings, of course, already account for around 35% of annual GHG emissions. This was a shocking stat that I saw in some of these cities. It's a lot more. I mean, you're looking at, you know, 80% of the emissions coming out of St. Louis are from buildings, 74% in Salt Lake City. So you can see the impact that this has in the industry that we're all in is really ripe for reduction and a really good target to help us get a lot of these emissions under control. And government leaders are really using it to reduce building energy use and GHG emissions, as we've talked about, but there are some nice ancillary benefits that we can go into here. So first, you have the climate change mitigation. That's what we're all talking about. That's what we're all here for. So a 20% reduction in the energy use across the entire country in the built environment would roughly equal about 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is a pretty big number. BPS another intention behind these rules are to help improve communities. Lower income households typically have higher energy burdens, and if we can help reduce the strain on those individuals who are, tenants in some of these buildings, it can actually, improve quality of life. And there are financial benefits, as people are probably well aware, to reducing consumption just in terms of how much you have to pay in your bills. And if that can trickle down to tenants, then all the better, of course. Talked about lower bills, better indoor air quality. A big change for a lot of these older buildings is modernizing their HVAC equipment, for instance. That can be a major, meaningfully impactful change that would be made. And modernizing HVAC uses less energy, provides better air quality indoors. Other ancillary benefits from modernizing buildings would come just from being and working in those buildings. And then, yes, creating jobs. Local contractors can benefit from BPS opportunities. Oftentimes in some of these poorer performing buildings, you're going to be looking at retrofits, retro commissioning. That requires people, and that's going to help, impact local communities and local economies. So those are really the four primary benefits of BPS. Obviously, the first bullet is the big one, but the others are also ancillary benefits and being considered by legislatures as they pass these laws. So let's talk a little bit about the currently active BPS laws. So this map, we have maps in our software, but this was a little bit easier to understand in terms of the size of the photo. So the green dots represent cities or counties where BPS laws have been passed and they're related to emissions. We're going to talk about the compliance pathways here in a little bit. The blue dots represent cities where the metric is just energy, so typically energy usage intensity, not necessarily GHG emissions. Then we have a whole bunch of places where it's either passed and under development, so the legislature has passed the law, but it hasn't yet gone into effect, or they haven't yet established the actual targets and standards. And then most of these dots, the red ones, are for cities where it's under consideration. So we have New York, Boston, DC, Denver, Boulder, the entire state of Washington, St. Louis, Chula Vista, Reno, which is voluntary, and Seattle are, as of today, as we speak here today, and July 25th, those are active BPS laws that have been passed, that do have standards and do have targets that have been established, and the reporting season is actually going to be starting soon in a couple of these. So as we move on to the developing BPS laws, so there's 5 jurisdictions. You see that on the left list: Aspen, the entire state of Colorado, the entire state of Maryland, Montgomery County, Maryland, and the state of Oregon. That's what I mentioned before. They have passed the BPS law. They said, this is coming. We are going to do this. The only question is, what are those actual standards going to be? And what is the compliance pathway going to look like? Excuse me. So those we know are coming. We just don't yet know what the actual standards are. So you can't actually plan for it, but you can know that in those cities, if you have properties in those cities, it is coming, and you should be at least starting to pay attention to your properties there and seeing how they're performing. Then we have this big long list on the right side. These are all jurisdictions that have either signed on to the National BPS Coalition, or they have laws that are in committee or being discussed, or they're somehow on the legislative docket. They have not passed yet, but they probably will be, and we don't exactly know when, but these are all on our watch list. We'll talk about that. A few questions came in about how we keep apprised of all the changes in the laws and how things are coming on board. We're keeping a close eye on all these cities, and this list is changing frequently. I think the last time we looked at this was a few months ago, and since then there's been a couple of cities that have been added to the list. So as you're looking at these, you're probably envisioning, okay, how many properties do I own in these jurisdictions? And obviously they tend to be larger cities, so there's probably a pretty good chance that you have properties within these jurisdictions. Typically a BPS law is applicable to just properties that are in that exact jurisdiction. So I know sometimes cities can kind of bleed out, or there could be neighborhoods or different, jurisdictional bodies within a geographical area. Almost always in all these laws, always in all these laws, you have to have an address within that particular jurisdiction for the law to apply. So as you can see from all this, this is a growing standard. It's very much emerging. and it's probably not going anywhere. It's only going to get more substantial in terms of cities and states that are signing on to this.
It's challenging, Todd.
Yeah, it can be a little bit challenging. So as we dove into this over the course of the past 6 or so months, we've realized that complying with these laws is going to be it's going to be a fairly big challenge, especially for owners and operators of real estate, excuse me, who have multiple buildings in many of these jurisdictions. What we found in researching and developing a solution for these laws to help track and monitor performance against them and also comply, first you have a uniqueness challenge. The laws are all different. Every single one is phrased differently, worded differently. I know the coalition is trying to get some consistency across the board, but where you have different jurisdictions with different climates, different property mixes, different ages of buildings, they have to consider that in all the drafting of these laws to make sure that we want to have these things make an impact, of course, but they can't be so challenging to meet that nobody can get there. They have to be fair. They have to understand unique challenges with certain properties. But they have, like I said, they have to be strong enough to make a meaningful impact. If it was easy and everybody could pass it, then it wouldn't really be adding much impact. So that's one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that these things are all unique and every single law is different. They're also very nuanced. There can be some subtleties and changes in the laws that can make them very difficult to navigate without expert guidance. I'll pick out the state of Washington, for example. They have 2 different compliance pathways depending on which climate zone you're in the state, because you have different climate regions within the state of Washington. There's a lot of states that are like that. And they realize that in fairness, we have to be able to have different standards for different climate zones in order to reach those standards. Well, that makes it challenging because now you have a property in Washington, you need to know, am I in climate zone 4C or am I in 5B? It's fairly nuanced. And then lastly, these are complicated. Some laws just require a simple metric like an Energy Star score. They'll have an Energy Star score reduction target. Others require some complex calculations to comply. If you're looking at GHG emissions, you're looking at CO2 equivalent. Well, you have to understand what are my mixes of energy types or fuels all the way down to, do you have diesel generators and is that causing emissions? All of that has to be compiled to get to a true GHG equivalent score or number for that individual property. Some of the laws require you to weather normalize your GHG emissions. So it's a fairness mechanism. That's great. But now weather normalization, a little more complicated. How do I know how my property's performing depending on, is it a really cold winter or a really hot summer? It's good that the laws are accounting for that, but it also makes compliance a little bit more challenging because now you have to do more math to get to that final number. So when you're looking at across the board, if you have properties in multiple jurisdictions that have BPS laws, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. And it's a really good idea to start getting out ahead of it because they are different and they all have their unique compliance pathways. Okay, so in case you didn't believe us, this was some feedback and we blurred out the names. There was an info session on Denver's BPS law where they hosted a webinar similar to this, and they were discussing the frameworks of their law and how to comply and all the different rules. And this was taken as a screenshot directly out of the chat where somebody says, this is incredibly daunting and complicated. And then another person chimes in and says, are you aware that there are many buildings in Denver, especially condominiums, that the lofty energy reduction goals and fines for not meeting the goals will bankrupt them? And then somebody just goes, this. And at the end of that webinar, the officials from Energize Denver, which is the program, said, you know what, we're going to maybe take a step back here and adjust a little bit. And we're going to see that happening. We're already seeing it happening, but we're going to see it happen more and more as, you know, like a lot of laws, these are passed with the best intentions, and then they're going to start hearing feedback about what if, how come, I can't do it, here's an exception, what about this? And you're going to see a lot of adjustments, and that's just going to be the nature of the beast for a little while. But yeah, this is really just to illustrate that last slide to show that this is complicated and some of these standards are fairly stringent. And if you have older buildings that you know are not very efficient, those are probably your ripe targets to start looking at first, because this is no joke, and it's going to be a serious thing to get compliance. Okay, so let's take a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about how these laws work, because they're very similar in terms of the way that they're structured, but they're very different in terms of the actual targets and what you have to do to comply and report. So the first factor is the coverage criteria. Which properties within a given jurisdiction are covered by BPS law. And there's really two main factors that typically go into this, and they're all a little bit nuanced and different. Keep that in the back of your mind throughout all of this. But generally, it's the property type. Almost always, it's going to include commercial, industrial, and multifamily buildings. Different property types can be excluded. There are sometimes government buildings are excluded because the government has their own standards that they're working off of. But commercial, industrial, and multifamily are typically the big three that are almost always included in every single law. However, they could have different timelines and different tranches or buckets in terms of the way that they have to report and the timing around it. We'll talk about that as well. Then we look at property size. Gross square footage tends to be the winner of the day. As everyone probably could suspect, larger buildings are typically prioritized. Oftentimes these laws will have time frames where they'll start with the largest buildings in the jurisdiction. And then as the law goes on and as people start complying, maybe 3 to 5 years down the road after the initial group of properties are due, they start introducing targets for the next tranche, which would be medium-sized buildings, and then all the way down to what they would consider small buildings. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what the basement or the floor threshold is. Around 20,000 feet is about the lowest I've seen for the laws to be applicable. So they're not looking at single family homes. They're not looking at small individual structures. It's really the larger buildings that are going to have the biggest carbon footprint and therefore the most meaningful impact. We look at potential exemptions. So again, every law is different, but you have to read through the text of the law and really understand it to understand, is my property possibly exempt? And highlighted here are 4 typical factors that would be an exemption. This doesn't apply across the board. Again, all of these are unique, but in some instances, if you have a portion of affordable or rent-controlled housing, that could be used as an exemption. The officially designated historical buildings or landmarks where doing retrofits or construction may not be allowed or may be tremendously difficult to maintain the structure of the building, that can be an exemption. Government buildings I mentioned are typically exempt, and that's really just because they have their own standards and own programs. There was a federal law passed for all government buildings on the federal level to meet certain BPS standards, so they've been carved out of most city and local jurisdictions and their requirements. And then lastly, new construction, under construction, or buildings that are slated for demolition or that have had recent retrofits, those can typically be designated for an exemption as well. I'll take a moment here to also explain a little bit of a nuance. Some of the laws, if you already have a certification, like say your property is LEED certified, or you have an Energy Star certification, so a score of 80 or above plus that cert, those can sometimes be used in lieu of compliance paperwork. So it doesn't necessarily mean the property is exempt, it's still covered, but by virtue of having gone through that sustainability designation and some of that reporting, they're saying you've already jumped through the hoops. You don't have to jump through the hoops again because you're proving that this property is already pretty efficient and would probably meet the standards. So keep that in mind as you start navigating through some of these laws, that if you do have properties that have already achieved certain sustainability certifications, that could be a compliance pathway where, again, it's not an exemption, but it would exempt you from some of the paperwork and some of the compliance mechanisms. And lastly, we're going to look at some of the typical target metrics. Again, going back to all these being different, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. These can vary by the property type and the size, but we're really looking at EUI. So how much energy are you using per square foot per year? Some have a weather normalized factor included to make it a little bit more fair, but also more difficult. Then we look at GHG intensity. Again, this time just looking at your total kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square foot per year. And then some do have an Energy Star score where the rule would be you have to either reach a certain number with Energy Star or a certain percentage improvement from your score 1 year to the next. So, if you're a 35 and you get to a 45 in some of these jurisdictions, that could carry the day. And I do see some questions coming in. We are going to leave time here at the very end to go through some pre-submitted questions. So hang tight. We'll get to your questions as we get to the end through this. But yeah, so those are typically the metrics. Within certain laws, there are multiple pathways for compliance. So you can actually choose your own adventure in some cases, where you can say, hey, this metric might be difficult to meet, but I already know that my Energy Star score should be attainable, so I'm going to go for that pathway. Okay, we'll keep going with a few more compliance pathways. So yeah, so that's kind of what I was just mentioning is sometimes the compliance pathway is performance against your own baseline. So they will take a baseline metric, they'll establish a year, say 2020, 2019, and say, okay, we're going to measure all of the property's performance for that year. That's typically in jurisdictions that already had benchmarking laws, so they already have the data. And then the requirement would be, okay, you have to show a certain percentage or overall improvement against your own baseline. That's how you comply. In other cases, it's performance towards an established target. So they're saying, I don't care what your baseline is, this is where you got to be. And certain properties are already performing very well and probably are already meeting that standard, and others will have a little bit of wood to chop to get there. All right, so the typical compliance procedures here. So normally it's going to be an annual or periodic submission requirement. Some of them are every couple of years, but for the most part, you can think about these as being annual. And they typically get more stringent over time. The understanding is that, okay, we're going to introduce these, we're going to let everyone get used to it, you're going to get your feet wet, and then as we go toward 2050, seems to be the line in the sand for many of these buildings to say, we want to either get to net zero or as close to net zero as we possibly can. But they're allowing people, they understand the difficulty of getting there, and most of these are getting, like I said, more stringent over time. So you'll have 5 years with metric A, and then the next 5 years get a little more stringent. And then they ratchet down again and they get a little bit more stringent. So they're looking for improvement over the long haul. And it isn't just, okay, I met this once, I'm good to go forever. You're going to have to pay attention to this for the next, 20 to 30 years and probably into the future. Again, we talked about they're grouped or tranche based. The properties typically are based on type and size. There's not any kind of uniform compliance process or tools. Sometimes you have to submit through Energy Star. That's part of the compliance. Other jurisdictions have custom forms or custom submission tools, whether it's online that you have to be able to go ahead and submit. And a lot of those jurisdictions will require third-party validation or verification to basically say, okay, somebody other than us looked at this data and gave it their seal of approval. We have professional engineers on staff here that are able to do that level of compliance and validation. Typically it's anyone with energy management certifications or accreditations can do that third-party validation. But again, each law is unique, and you have to look at the language of each law to determine what actually is that third-party validation that is required before I submit to get full compliance. Some of them will also offer alternative compliance pathways. As I mentioned before, they recognize that every building is its own special snowflake, and they can have their own unique challenges in meeting some of these requirements. So many of the jurisdictions will allow you to submit your own proposal. If you say, hey, listen, I'm not going to be able to meet this standard for XYZ reason, and you typically do have to provide reasoning. But you say, but I can go from here to here, or I can show this level of improvement. Oftentimes, you're able to submit those alternative pathways for approval. And if the jurisdiction finds that this is okay, good enough, and it shows that you're making the effort, they'll go ahead and approve that. Purchasing RECs is another way to reduce GHG emissions. So if you realize that construction is going to be difficult, some of this could be expensive, and in the meantime approach is essentially just purchasing green energy. So the more renewable energy that's part of your mix, the better in terms of your GHG emissions, especially for electricity. So that is a pathway. And I'll take a moment here to mention that happening in the background that you're all probably well aware of are a lot of improvements being made to just the utility infrastructure in general. So as the grids themselves get more efficient and as coal gets phased out of some of these power plants and they're looking at more renewable energy sources for the power plant, you will get the benefit of that grid getting more efficient. Not sure how familiar everyone is of how e-grid factors work, but depending on where you are in the country and your grid and where you're getting your power from, there's essentially a coefficient assigned to how to get your GHG calcs. And that has a lot to do with the fuel mix that goes into your local power plant, which obviously for the most part, you can't really do anything about that. But the benefit is as they modernize and as they get better, those e-grid factors are going to get adjusted, and then you could get the benefit of a modernized grid without having really done anything. Now, that is not a recommendation to sit on your hands and do nothing and wait for the grid to get better, but this is a group effort, and it's something that the whole country is getting behind in terms of helping to support this. So as those grids get more modern and efficient, you will get that benefit. There's also just retrofits and retro commissioning done at your buildings, looking at things like startup and shutdown schedules and, putting potentially data loggers on pieces of equipment that are older or potentially are inefficient. Those are really good ways to identify potentially some low-hanging fruit to help really improve those emission scores and the efficiency of the building. Some jurisdictions also do offer alternative compliance payments, which is another way of saying, I know I'm not going to get there, I don't want to get fined, but I'll pay a little bit in advance, which you could argue is similar to purchasing RECs, to say I'm going to somewhat buy my way out of compliance, which won't work for the long haul, but at least in the short term, there's a way to avoid some of those more serious penalties that could come with the fines for non-compliance. So those are typically the alternative compliance pathways. Again, within certain laws, they could have multiple paths where you could choose and say, okay, I'm going down path A, which is a EUI pathway, and that will be your pathway for that property. But you do have to indicate before you submit which compliance pathway you're choosing and how you're choosing to go about that. So Michelle talked at the beginning that we're not really going to go through individual laws in detail, but it does make sense a little bit, I think, to take a high level approach to see how some of these laws work. So this is BERDO 2.0, and it applies to Boston. It's section 7.2-2 or 7-2.2 of the Boston Code. All of this is public information. You can look it up. But basically, you can see that this is a municipal law that gives the city the authority to set carbon emission standards for large buildings. So it kind of covers what we've talked about already, that they're really focusing on those large buildings. And this is a carbon emission reduction. You can see in the lower box on the lower left that the coverage criteria here is all buildings in Boston that are 20,000 square feet or above are subject to this law. The compliance deadlines and penalties really are dependent on property type. Here they make a designation between residential and non-residential. I know some of you are probably asking, what about mixed use? You'd have to get into the details of the law to determine if you have a multifamily building that has a restaurant or a store in the base. That's typically going to be considered a residential building, but there could be carve-outs or unique situations for that particular property mix. So group one here in Boston are considered the large properties, anything 35,000 square feet or above, or 35 or more multifamily units for residential, or non-residential properties with 2 or more buildings on the same parcel that equal 100,000 square feet or above. So right there, you can already see it's complicated, right? There's 3 different criteria just to describe what a large building is. It's either 35,000 feet, 35 units, or a couple of buildings on the same parcel of 100,000 feet. So there you already have 3 different pieces of information you need to grab just to see, am I in group 1 or am I in group 2? And the group 2 are considered the smaller properties, 20,000 to 35,000 square feet or 15 to 35 units. So highlighted here on the lower right, you can see these non-compliance penalties, which are fairly significant. If you're out of code, if you're out of the standard, it's $1,000 a day for non-compliance. So ignore this for a year. Everyone can do the math. 365 grand is probably not a thing that you'd want to have to explain to your board or your shareholders of why that got penalized because the property was out of compliance. They make a little bit of a concession for smaller properties, but it's still $300 a day. So it's not low stakes. These are some serious penalties that could be involved. So this is a good example of Boston showing how the different property types have different emission standards. So at Conservice, we typically have a heavy focus on multifamily housing, which you can see about halfway down the list. They're looking at 4.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square foot per year as the first performance metric. So that's going to apply from years 2025 to 2029. And then as you can see here, it gets ratcheted down over time until we get to 2050 when we're at net zero. But you can see the differences between the different property types, which is their way of saying we recognize that all of these different types of properties consume energy differently. So we're going to give you a chance to meet these standards based on a whole lot of research and some of these benchmarking laws. Now is probably a good time to mention that I think it's probably obvious, but it may not be. You need whole building data to comply with these. And part of the challenge with the legislatures is basically saying if we're going to go ahead and promulgate these laws, we have to give the buildings within the jurisdiction the ability to comply, which means you typically need to have a mechanism to get that aggregate whole building data. Oftentimes there's integrations directly with Energy Star where the aggregate data will go right in there. Sometimes you do have to make a special request, but that is part of the cooperation between the jurisdiction and the utilities of saying, hey, if we're going to promulgate these standards and we're going to say you have to do this, we have to give people a way to comply, because especially in the multifamily world, they recognize that getting that tenant data isn't always even possible. Even where it is possible, it can be extraordinarily painful. So they're looking at ways of making sure that you at least have access to that aggregate whole building data. So this, again, is just one example. I'll go back before Michelle takes over here to show you that, this is a good example of where they have set the standard. There are other standards where it's just against your own baseline, but this should give you a pretty good idea of the kind of reduction targets we're looking at and the time horizons that a lot of these laws are designed to cover. It isn't just a short-term thing. This is looking years into the future. So go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, so I think it makes sense to just shift gears a little bit in terms of how do I prepare for these BPS standards that are coming forward, that are continuing to grow, especially for those that have properties in multiple locations. In general, Todd and I talked about it a little bit earlier today of just things you can start doing in-house is getting your data pushed into Energy Star now, using Energy Star Portfolio Manager as a good benchmarking tool. Start looking at those low performing buildings, start getting ahead of identifying where it might make sense to do energy audits, retrofits, things to that extent, so start preparing in advance before it even becomes a requirement. And also start looking at renewable energy credits in general and how that could maybe make sense for getting into your budgets heading into kind of future years. So those are some little tidbits you might want to be thinking about. Something else, of course, on the Conservice side of how we're supporting our clients is through a combination of technology and services and kind of robust expertise with the in-house team that we have. So we do have a solution in-house within our ESG software, again, as accompanied with that services element that's going to be focused on identification, validation, and then compliance support. So those are kind of key ways to be thinking about how to even approach BPS across your whole portfolio, identifying where it's required, looking for those exemptions, helping to validate where it's necessary if you're meeting the requirements, and then just overall compliance. So that's a high level way to be thinking about it. And then if you hit the next slide for me, Todd, because you have control, will also be the actual performance tracking, right? So a lot of these jurisdictions are requiring that you're tracking against, there's this different baselines as an example, or different performance requirements. So being able to track that performance and that kind of year-over-year analytics and comparative analytics as well. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it really comes down to risk identification and mitigation, because as Todd mentioned, there's some fairly large fines associated with these different locations. And so really getting ahead of that and meeting those standards is key to compliance. So those are different ways on how Conservice in particular can help support clients. but also, again, wanting to be informative for the larger group that's joining us today, some other things to be thinking about. Todd, anything else you would add or expand on that before we start diving into the questions? We've got a few.
Yeah, I think the only thing is that this is a new thing and it is going to be evolving. And we've already seen some changes in laws that have been passed before they've even gone into effect. So an additional challenge on top of all of this is the fact that the ground is going to be shifting beneath our feet for a little while. And it's going to be a little bit of a moving target. And there will be times when laws get amended or new laws come on board, or they realize, like in Denver, we had the best of intentions, but this is going to be extraordinarily difficult to comply with. So there will be changes. So we are keeping on track of this. And there was a question that came up that we'll get to about this. But keep in mind that this isn't something that you'll just be able, if you're responsible for this within your organization, this isn't something that you can really check in on every 6 months or to a year. Like, it is changing rapidly, and you're going to have to really be on top of it to make sure that you don't somehow miss something that could have an impact on your property. So they do give you time to comply. It isn't like they'll pass something today and you have to comply tomorrow. But there is a lot of change happening. And there's unanswered questions out there, like what happens, for instance, when I'm covered by 2 BPS laws. I have a building in Denver that's technically subject to Denver and also to the state of Colorado. The answer is we don't know. We expect that if one of the laws is more stringent, then that probably would serve as an exemption from the other. Or if you show compliance with one, you get automatic compliance with the other. But that hasn't been officially stated yet. So you have jurisdictions like Seattle, where there's also a state of Washington requirement. The state of California almost certainly will have a standard, but you're going to have cities that have different ones as well. So it's something to keep in mind that you may not just be subject to one, you could be subject to multiple of these laws.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a perfect segue. Todd, if you hit the next slide there. We do have a tool on the Conservice website that's available to everyone on our general public website that is linking to these different developing standards. So it's showing all of the current active ones under building performance standards right now. On that, it gives a brief snippet of the requirements themselves and then links to further information, right? So there are a few questions that are coming in for related to penalties, or is my property exempt, or will I be required to do this? Highly recommend starting here as a good resource. You can also email us at the email address that's listed here for these questions, and we'll send that through to the appropriate parties and internally. But this link is a really great tool. So as we have additional changing regulations, Conservice is making the commitment to continue to update that. And then those that are utilizing our own in-house services, we're going to be supporting our clients with keeping them proactively up to date as well in that ever-changing landscape. So in my opinion, those are some 2 really great sources for kind of staying on top of these regulatory requirements. I don't know, Todd, if you have any other suggestions on what certain cities are doing to kind of share this information across the board, or if anything you'd add.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to do it. I mean, people are probably familiar with, setting Google alerts, or you can set alerts on news articles and set certain key terms in there. We subscribe to a service called LexisNexis, which is basically a legal bulletin service where you can see, new and important information that's coming out of legislatures. But of course, there's a lot of noise in that, because if you subscribe to one of those services, you're going to get a bunch of irrelevant stuff. So yeah, I think it's really, IMT is another good resource. The Institute for Market Transformation, they're part of this BPS coalition that's growing. But that's the other, I guess, challenge to this, is there's no like one-stop shop to collate all this other than ourselves, shameless plug, to make sure that you're staying on top of all the changes in the laws.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's dive into some questions. We have a few that was shared in advance, and then of course, if you have any other additional questions, please feel free to, like I said, put it into the GoToWebinar control panel that you should have in front of you. But in no particular order, so there were a few questions related to kind of public companies in particular. So what are the most used disclosure metrics for public companies, would you say, Todd?
I mean, it doesn't matter. It's public versus private. It's all about the size of your building and the property type. So yeah, there were a few questions of, are publicly owned or REITs, are they exempted somehow? The answer is no. The only difference is government buildings, like we talked about, that those can have their own standards. Depending on the law, if it's a local municipal government building versus a federal building, federal buildings are already under their own federal standards. But yeah, the ownership structure doesn't typically matter. It's the size of the building and the property type that typically is going to control.
Yeah, and there's a couple other questions too related to that in terms of standards affecting like shopping centers in particular for commercial. So I think from what you've mentioned and what we've seen is that, again, it's city and or state dependent. Some might be just specific commercial buildings versus including the retail and shopping centers. So is it a safe bet to kind of indicating that each law has its own kind of unique snowflake, again, of coverage requirements?
Yeah, and I don't specifically, sometimes you'll have shopping center, like the Boston law can have retail targets based on, the retail standard. But I haven't really seen shopping centers specifically be carved out. It's really, again, if it's a big enough center, if it's, a Walmart superstore or something that's, over that square footage threshold, it's going to be subject to the law.
Awesome. And then, Todd, I know you briefly mentioned this, but maybe to expand with this question. So what regulations are coming that give landlords rights to utility information for their assets where the tenants are in control of the meters? This is a real problem and pending progress for benchmarking buildings. Yep.
Yeah, so they're trying to come up with ways, and the best way, again, is that aggregate building data, that whole building data, because there could be privacy concerns with tenant data and knowing that, how much each tenant is using. It gets very complicated when you get into billing scenarios and bill back scenarios. But ultimately, the jurisdictions know that if you're going to pass one of these laws and force compliance, you have to give the building owners a way to know what they're actually consuming at the whole property. So whole building aggregate data is going to be the most frequently used. And then again, you'll have to know the mechanism of how to get that data, whether it's by special request or through Energy Star is another typical pathway.
Yeah, again, kind of each city and utility is its own snowflake.
Yep.
Okay, got a few in here. So there was a question related to, sharing our strategies here at Conservice for assisting clients in monitoring the properties, which are required for BPS and benchmarking requirements. So we briefly touched on that and how we're keeping track of all the jurisdiction laws and their coverage criteria. As Todd mentioned, we also subscribe to different alerts services as these new laws are being amended or either moving forward. And then, as I briefly mentioned, we do have a service that will be in place to help support our clients both with the tracking, the validating, and the submission of these different performance requirements. So if anyone would like to learn more about that, we've got a lovely email address that's in the slide you're looking at here. And again, we've got that tool that we mentioned, which is a great source for just tracking that those upcoming regulations on our website. All right, Todd, I've got a fairly complicated one that I'll admit I wasn't completely familiar with what this was, but since we have the time, I'll mention it. There's a question related to ASHRAE 241 standards. So how will the new ASHRAE 241 standards impact this 101 standards? So I don't know, Todd, if you want to comment on that and what we learned from the team.
Yeah, so, and this was over my head as well, but we went to our in-house team of experts, and their response was that ASHRAE 241 would have a minimal impact on BPS because it really deals with infectious aerosols, which typically doesn't have a large impact on the energy consumed at a building. However, there are some applications of that ASHRAE 241 standard for retro commissioning and retrofits, which could wind up being relevant in BPS. So not directly related, especially in terms of the aerosols, but yes, still something that could come into play as you go through some of the compliance measures.
Fantastic. And then another question that was here that I missed, but is Conservice an approved vendor to submit for BPS or other target adjustments?
Yes. Yeah, like you typically need someone on staff or someone with a professional engineering credential or certification to be able to go ahead and validate that data that you're submitting. And yes, we do have people on staff with those accreditations.
Awesome. Always love hearing that. And then here's a great question. So are there any BPS laws in Canada or in the UK that we're familiar with?
Not that I'm familiar with at the moment, but candidly, our focus has been on the US. So we typically support clients in the US and in Canada. So Canada is another frontier that will be examined. But yes, for now, it's just been US focused.
Yeah, and I know that in Canada, there are some provincial requirements for like the ordinance benchmarking, that annual submission of data. They also use Energy Star Portfolio Manager as a tool to share that data set. So I don't think I would be surprised if more building performance specific standards continue to move forward. But to Todd's point, I don't think so at this given moment, although it might be in the developing section. All right, there's a few additional questions related to different exemptions and or penalties. And I think just in general, Todd, kind of the response to that is fairly unique based on the different ordinances. So you gave a brief example with Boston. There's a few more questions related to kind of the affordable aspect as part of an exemption. Again, I would probably reference the tool on our website to dive into the specific ordinances, because each city is a little bit unique, but I don't know if that's worth expanding on.
Yeah, I mean, we did see in Boston that, so for the large buildings, it was $1,000 a day. For small buildings, it's $300 a day. It does bear mentioning that typically these penalties, this is not a revenue creation opportunity for the states. They don't see it that way. They want compliance, and they're hanging these threats essentially to force compliance, but they're not trying to make money off of this. So typically, if you can show that you're trying to comply or you're taking measures, oftentimes you can talk to the officials at the state and either get an extension or figure out, some other plan. We talked about those alternative compliance pathways. Like, it isn't necessarily done to be a gotcha. It's more of, we're serious about this, and there are actual penalties and ramifications for failing to comply. In terms of a certain percentage of affordable housing, it's hard to say with a broad brush. Like Seattle, for example, Seattle's law does have, it's not necessarily an exemption, but it's a deferral. So if you have a certain portion of affordable housing in Seattle, you don't have to start until, I believe, 2036 is your first reporting deadline. So it's just an example of how specific these laws are crafted and how different potential hardships in compliance are being accounted for with either a flat out exemption or an extended timeline to be able to comply.
Yeah, and actually that's a good segue into an additional question, was asking if any current deadlines within these active cities are listed on our website, and they are listed in the links and in the brief overview for each city that's currently considered active.
Yep.
And it's, again, something that we're tracking within our platform tool as well.
Yep.
But that's on the
2025 is most of these laws are the first reporting is due in 2025. Some are sooner. And if you're operating in Colorado and Denver, you know that you already have some requirements. New York's local law 97 has been on the books for a little while. So yeah, this has been emerging, and there are submissions that are due, even next year. But most of the time, 2025 is going to be the first year that they're looking at for that initial target date. And some of them are interim targets. So you'll have your actual target, the fines won't kick in until 2030, say. But there will be a reporting requirement before that, just to get you in the swing of things and see how on track you potentially are before you actually get dinged with a fine.
Awesome. And then I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Todd, I see one of the more recent ones that was listed here. Do we foresee that other government reference, making sure I'm reading this right. Do we foresee that other governments reference current laws to craft their own? And as an additional question, would there ever be a need for a governing body to oversee these standards like ISO does for other areas?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And yeah, there's kind of a blueprint and a template that is being promulgated, again, by that National Build or BPS coalition. But then, of course, every local city legislature and city council likes to do things their own way. So they'll take the blueprint and they'll make their own little tweaks and adjustments to put their stamp on it. Some of it legitimate, of course, because of the regionality and differences in climate and what these actual performance standards need to be. But some of it because they can't help themselves. So yeah, that makes our job a little bit harder. But yeah, they're all basically the same thing. We're trying to reduce by a given time with targets and fines attached to those. Now, how you get there is very different. And yeah, typically it's a Department of Buildings that would oversee this. It goes into the city enforcement, and that's how that's the enforcement mechanisms. Because I haven't seen any buildings get fined yet, I don't know how that actually would work. But that's part of obviously the requirement.
Awesome. Well, I think that took us right about to the end. If there's additional questions that anyone has or any that maybe we didn't get to during the webinar, please, again, feel free to use that esgsales@conservice.com to send additional questions, or we'll follow up directly for any that we didn't get to today. Just as another kind of closing statement, so as a reminder, we will be sending the webinar, the recording, as well as the slides to all the attendees today. But thank you so much for your time. This was really great. Thank you to Todd and all your expertise in kind of walking through this with us. And we appreciate it, and looking forward to continuing to collaborate further together as an industry on how to tackle these. So thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone.